Hello, everyone. Welcome to our crisis group event. It's an honor to have you join us for this important discussion about Syria post-Assad. My name is Cristina Butrus. I'm the Senior Communications and Advocacy Officer for the MENA at Crisis Group. For those unfamiliar with Crisis Group, we're an independent organization dedicated to shaping policies to prevent and resolve deadly conflict around the world. So, as we all know, 13 years ago in Daraa, Syrians took to the streets demanding change. What followed was the brutal civil war that caused incredible suffering. But now the Assad regime is over. Rebels walked into Damascus without resistance. Thousands of prisoners, many held for years in horrific conditions, are finally free. And thousands of refugees are now crossing back into Syria. This moment offers hope and opportunity, but it also raises pressing questions. How can Syrians rebuild their country on their own terms? How can they ensure stability, preserve institutions, and navigate complex dynamics with regional and international players? To unpack these questions and more, I'm joined by an incredible panel of experts today. First, I would like to welcome Nanar Hawach, Senior Analyst for Syria, Jerome Drevon, Senior Analyst on Jihad and Modern Conflict, Berkay Mandıracı, Senior Analyst for Turkey, Delaney Simon, Senior Analyst for the US Program. So we will start with a discussion, followed by a Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box, include your name and your affiliation. You can ask your question at any time, and if it's relevant to the questions I'm asking, I will try to include it in the conversation. And if not, we will leave it to the second part of our conversation that is dedicated for Q&As. I would like also to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. Let's get started. I will start with Nanar. Can you tell us a bit on what life looks like for Syrians right now, both those that are still in the country and those abroad? What are their hopes, fears, priorities as they look to the future?
Thank you, Christina. People, for the first time in decades, they feel hope. They feel that change is possible. And even more importantly for people, that they can take charge in this change. They can take a role and play a role in this change. This is a feeling shared by people within Syria and people abroad. And as you know, Syria is a mosaic and filled with different ethnicities and sects and people having their own views. However, the majority and the unbelievable majority of the population, they share this feeling of hope, and they can play a role in the future of their country and where to take their country. Of course, this hope is mixed with some fears of uncertainty, fears of the future, what's going to happen. Some people think it's too good to be true. At the beginning, people thought Assad is going to come back. It is too good to be true. Now it started to land, like this feeling that there's a new Syria. It started to land. People started to, come to peace with it. But there is, of course, fears for the future. How will Syria's future be? Will foreign actors leave Syria? Will there be internal clashes within Syria? Will there be insecurity? How's the economic situation? Of course, there's fears with any new state, but hopefully the hope side is winning now.
Thank you, Nanar. I will go to Jerome and to take a step back and look a bit about what Syria went through in the past decade. We see Syria as a patchwork of different factions and different groups, and sometimes for people who are not directly following this context, it can be confusing. So can you briefly outline for us like the key players and their current roles in shaping Syria's future?
Yes, thank you for this question. Everybody has been focusing on HTS and Jolani, so I will explore that, but later on. When we look at Syria and those that the armed groups that contributed to the fall down of the regime, we can basically differentiate three main alliances. I mean, first you have those groups from the south that were the first to enter Damascus. Those were very local groups that used to be called the Southern Front, and they used to be coordinated by Jordan. So they disarmed a few years ago, but they were never like fully, settled with the regime. So those started to coordinate with HTS when HTS and other armed groups starting to move forward from the north. So they are mostly like local groups that will not have the most important role for the future of Syria. Then the second type of armed groups are what is called the Syrian National Army. That's similarly, it's a patchwork of armed groups. They officially are structured like an army, but in practice, it's still a coalition of different entities, some of whom are more Islamist, some are more local, some have been more controversial in how they've behaved locally in terms of leaning more towards criminal activities as well. So those have contributed to the war effort, but only in coordination with the largest alliance and the most powerful, which is led by HTS. So the third alliance basically started from the northwest, from the province of Idlib. It's coordinated as a more structured military entity around HTS, which is the former Jabhat al-Nusra, after it renounced Al-Qaeda, it changed name in 2017, but also other groups, most prominently Sham, Filaq al-Sham, and smaller local entities. Those have really restructured their military efforts for the past few years to improve their military efficiency. So they've been leading the insurgency. Basically, they were the one that took over Aleppo, then Hama, then Homs, and it's led by HTS, though in coordination with other factions. And there are really those now that are in charge. All the orders about how factions should behave, about the naming of a new temporary government, came from this alliance of group. And we see also the diplomatic effort being led very much by HTS. So de facto, this is the alliance that's recognized as the strongest among all the armed groups at present, and the others have to coordinate with them because they are clearly not as powerful and they are accepting their lead at the moment. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will come back to you, Jerome, with more questions on this. But moving to Nanar, and Jerome, feel free to jump in on this question as well. So you talked about HTS now being the new authorities in Damascus. So from the perspective of these new authorities, what do you think their immediate priorities should be in this transitional period?
Yeah, I would say, sorry, maintaining stability and security, maintaining governance, maintaining the economic situation from collapsing, and for a bit further down the line, very short, like in 3 months, focusing on power sharing. And to expand on these, HTS, I'll explain the situation that's happening right now. HTS has been doing a very good job at sending signals and messages to the Syrian population and different sub-communities that we are here we have nothing against you, we are here to protect you, we are here to kind of like to push towards a new Syria. They have been trying their very best to their capabilities and limitations to follow on their words and to apply what they promised. You see that very well in Damascus. The security has improved a lot. They have let people, conduct their daily business. However, the situation is not as stable, and the security is not as good as it is in Damascus or another and Aleppo. The more you see a clear focus from HTS on urban centers, which is understandable, but it leads to insecurity the more you go away from urban centers. So cities like the countryside of Hama, of Homs, of minority-dominated coast like Latakia and Tartus and Jebla and whatnot, they have seen some insecurity. Also, the south, there has been some levels of insecurity, and that is simply, to put it simply, HTS right now lacks the capabilities and the manpower to maintain security over this, over what they controlled in 11 days. So I would say the number one priority is to try to improve the security of the country or where HTS controls. The second thing, Syria has been, even before the civil war, a weak country economically. 13 years of civil war and sanctions and destruction and predatory behaviors by the regime, the former regime, made it uninhabitable. So the focus should be also on providing the basic needs for the population. This is not only to keep the population alive, but also to maintain stability and some sort of governance. What HTS also is doing a very good job at is maintaining government institutions running. They did that from day one. They even relied on former regime high officials to help them maintain government institutions. I would say this played a very good part in keeping the country running. And as I said, future down the line, HTS should give space for different different powers and different entities within Syria to share power with it, but that's down the line. Yeah.
And what about the army?
So yeah, the army and the security. So there's the army in the former regime or regime forces, while the army, militias, this is one side. There's the security apparatus and there's the police. Right now, the army, all of them have been dismantled. The army and especially the police, they have been giving amnesties, and it has been very smooth, if I may say so. Like overall, of course, there's some incidents happen, but overall, it has been very smooth, very easy to get these amnesties. HTS HTS's leader promised to create a new army and to dissolve HTS and other factions within this new army. There has been talks about even some former army officers who are specialized to be, if they want, and of course if they have nothing against them when it comes to atrocities or killings or whatnot, if they want to join, it's still to my knowledge right now, it's still not confirmed. There's no decision being taken. When it comes to the security apparatus, it has been dissolved, and there has been very kind of a clear signal that they will not come back again, which is very good. When it comes to the police, it's still unclear. What we know is that HTS has created or like asked or opened recruitment for police, but this will take some time. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Nanar. On this, also to Jerome, so you've also followed HTS governance model in Idlib for some time. How do you think like the new authorities can ensure to govern inclusively and gain the trust of all Syrians? What are exactly the lessons to be learned, whether positive or negative, from the HTS governance model in Idlib? Jerome, you're on mute. You have to repeat.
Sorry. What we can see is that from 2019 onwards, HTS has supported the creation of the Syrian Salvation Government. So relations between the SSG and HTS were a bit controversial because some people would just assume that SSG is entirely HTS, is like a civilian facade for HTS full control, while HTS claimed that it doesn't have connections to the SSG. Reality is a bit in between. Basically, the SSG is an act of delegation. So HTS delegated parts of civilian governance to independence in practice for many things, for like humanitarian work, for education, health, etc. While HTS still controlled the political voice of the province, still control security, large parts of the economy, and so on. And so the relations were a bit blurry. And what we could see is that in practice, HTS agreed to open up on several fields, including religious, towards Muslims who disagreed with it. Muslims who are not Salafis, for example, like Sufis, on religious minorities, even though it was not fully acknowledging their rights, still there was a real opening. So basically was to say that we can, open up, but still control the political voice of the province. And so one of the big challenge for HTS would be to have a different approach in Damascus, because what could be justified in the past as saying Idlib is in a temporary situation, it's a state at war, we are not going to have, full inclusion while at war. That might have been true in the past, but that's no longer the case. So they will have to also start to share power with others, but that means sharing power with some of those who contributed to the takeover of Damascus, but they shouldn't share power only with other armed groups. They also have to share power with a wide range of representations among Syrians from inside, from the diaspora, and so on. And that's going to be a challenge. Because you have to find a way basically to make it work. What Nanar mentioned is about the temporary authorities. HTS had basically two choices. Either you become more inclusive now, but it could have taken time because you have to find out who could contribute to the government, how to include them, and so on, or you maintain some stability and continuity. And so they favored stability and continuity. So they named the head of the Syrian Salvation Government as the new prime minister. They tried to have some continuity with the previous government and so on, but by still saying that this would be the situation till March. So maintaining some continuity while saying we don't have to monopolize power, this is just temporary. But the question mark is still there. What happens next? Who is going to be in charge of writing the constitutions, of contributing to the state apparatus? What will be the role of different communities? Minorities, but not only. Also different urban centers, people who don't necessarily have the same view as HTS. And this is a matter in question. Some people have already questioned, for example, that some other armed groups some of their leaders have been named governors in different areas, like in Latakia, in the periphery of Damascus and so on, which can be understood because you still have to have buy-in by other armed groups. But ultimately, you need to find also deeper solutions. So that would include how to create an army, so dissolving the factions, potentially disarming some of them, but then also having something much broader with regards to society. The past has not shown a full inclusivity, but at the same time, there were circumstances. And now HTS has to transform into something different. I think many are willing to give them a chance because they achieve this outcome. They're willing to give them a chance, but doesn't mean that the chance will be taken. They really will be judged now on what they're going to do in the next 6 months, next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have a question from Alex related to this. How do you see the involvement of previous exiled political opposition going forward? I'm not sure if Jerome, Nanar has anything, you have anything to say on this.
I think some of them will have to be included, but I don't think we can see HTS as just giving power to people who are from abroad. Ultimately, reality also is that those groups have taken control of the country, and they will have to share it, but they are not going to just give it away to some individuals outside. So I don't see the coalition or the interim government being integrated as such, but some of their personalities, yes, that's definitely something to be conceived.
Okay, thank you. So now going to our Turkey analyst, Berkay. Berkay, what role has Turkey played in enabling these power shifts in Damascus? How has Ankara has reacted to these changes so far? And also, moving forward, how do you see their relationship with HTS evolving?
Yes, thank you very much, Christina. A pleasure to be part of this discussion. I think it's fair to sum up the mood in Turkey on Assad's fall oscillating between fervor and cautious optimism. There is the assessment that Ankara, could benefit from this power transition in Damascus, and also play a key role in helping Syria back on its feet. And it's probably worthwhile to sort of step back a little, at least to understand why, that mood has come about. Of course, not only the regime collapsed, but Russia and Iran are also out of the picture. And especially the Russian involvement in Syria has been a big headache for Ankara for a long time. The situation in Idlib, where you have millions of refugees, millions of people living, was certainly an issue at the time. And there was a risk that Russian and regime advances would drive out a substantial number of refugees towards the Turkish border. And that gave Russia a lot of leverage over Ankara at the time. And there was also, the government was facing a lot of political pressure, of course, because of the existing presence of refugees in Turkey and the waning support for the government on that account. And that was the main reason why Turkey sort of tried to entrench itself militarily in the northwest at the time, and also provided a protective umbrella for parts of the opposition there, which, to some degree, the HTS also made use of, and Ankara sort of tolerated the HTS's presence at its border for various reasons. And through that engagement, Ankara was able to freeze the front lines. It struck multiple deals with Russia, and also got involved militarily. But of course, that didn't resolve the situation. There was attempts at going back to negotiations, the Astana process. Geneva wasn't really moving anywhere. So there was a buildup of frustrations around Syria, the Syria issue not being resolved. And of course, in 2022, Turkey's even tried to change tack, and it adopted a bit of a more pragmatic outlook towards Syria. It was said at least that it was ready to mend ties with Assad. There were channels that Ankara established with the former regime, but that didn't go anywhere either. And even when the opposition advances first began, the messaging coming out of Ankara was that they hoped that this would actually bring Assad back to the negotiating table and take the opposition seriously. So it's sort of natural and understandable that with the Assad regime now gone, and with its backers also not being in the picture anymore, there is a sigh of relief in Ankara. And now you have less actors on the ground. That makes things less complicated for Ankara. You have potentially a likely Ankara-friendly government in Damascus, which is still not 100% certain. But so the odds, at least for now, look good for Ankara, and it can really be the actor in the region that could have the most influence both over the government in Damascus and potentially also benefit from this. Especially Turkey has its longest land border is with Syria. It is 911 kilometers long. And we're also seeing that a lot of businesses are now gearing up to also invest in Syria, Turkish businesses. One day after the Assad regime fell, a Turkish construction and cement companies, their shares in the Istanbul Stock Exchange, they surged. So there is certainly an expectation that Ankara will also play a big role in the rebuilding and reconstruction. And there, a lot of companies also see business opportunities in Syria. And of course, there's the expectation that a substantial number of refugees that Turkey has generously hosted for over a decade now might be going back. So that's how I would sum up the mood here and the interests involved, especially with regard to the picture in Damascus.
Mm-hmm. So still on Turkey, a main concerning flashpoint now is the northeast as well. So we're seeing increased tension between Turkey, the SDF, Turkey-backed forces, the NSA moving more east. How do you explain what's happening, the timing, and what should be done to prevent a further escalation?
Yeah, that's part of the puzzle that is not as promising and encouraging. We're seeing that at the moment, well, the northeast is controlled by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, which Ankara views as an extension of the PKK, which has been its arch enemy for many years. And the SDF is backed by the US for the purposes of fighting ISIS in that area. And Ankara fears that the control of the SDF that it exerts in this area poses and could potentially pose a security threat to its vital security interests moving forward. And when the opposition advances began, we saw in the west of the Euphrates that Turkey-backed SNA opposition groups, they drove out the SDF from Tel Rifat, also from Manbij, where the US seemed to have used its leverage to defuse the situation and brokered an arrangement whereby the SDF withdraw to the east of Euphrates. And now, we're seeing the situation in Kobani becoming quite precarious with the SNA pushing into Kobani as well. The US seems to be trying to de-escalate where it can, with troop patrols, back channels. Some US officials have also brought up the, potential imposition of sanctions on Ankara if things get out of hand. And that's going to be an important thing to watch as well. But for Turkey, of course, this has long been a priority, a leading priority. So in the decision-making spectrum, at this point in time, I sort of see two camps. One more looking at this as a potential opportunity to also get done with what Ankara has seen as a process that has taken too long, with the SDF getting more and more entrenched in the northeast. And the other camp, which is more cautious, who worry that US sanctions might hurt the Turkish economy, and they want who want to tread more carefully and do not want to strain relations with European capitals and the US. And we'll see which of these camps will potentially prevail. But I mean, the Northeast is really critical to the future of Syria, also the stability of Syria, not only for Ankara. I mean, Ankara has sees this as a leading security priority, but also the SDF, they held on to this area for many years. They've established governance structures there, and they also want to have a seat, a representation in Damascus, and potentially move towards some decentralization in the future of Syria, which Turkey opposes because they see them too aligned with and having too many links to the PKK. And the Northeast is also important for the new Syrian government, for Damascus, because, it's an area that harnesses or is home to the country's important natural resources, which the SDF controls at the moment. And of course, the new government's control over the entirety of the country is at stake here. And for the US and the coalition forces, obviously, they are involved because they still see ISIS as a threat. You have detention facilities, the Al-Hol camp, that are home to former ISIS members and their families. So it's kind of unclear, and the assessment is that this still could potentially pose a leading security concern for the Northeast. So all these actors that are involved, for all of them, have their own interests, and though these interests don't align, but Turkey and the US, they are two NATO allies. We should not forget that. And they are now backing separate local actors on the ground. So hopefully, diplomacy and some sort of an understanding that they could forge towards these different actors can help diffuse the situation, de-escalate the situation, and finally nudge this region, this pocket of Syria, towards some sort of a stable end state.
Thanks, Berkay. Now going to Jerome on the same question of ISIS. So you mentioned already the concerns about the resurgence of ISIS in the East. So Jerome, what is the likelihood of this happening? And I'm not sure if Delaney wants to answer the next question on what role should the US troops play in that area as well.
I think it's an immediate threat more than necessarily a long-lasting threat. As Berkay mentioned, now there is a vacuum in the East, and not just vacuum, but let's say some uncertainty. What will happen? What will happen with the SDF? What will happen with the SNA? Potentially, if those two clash, is HTS going to enter the fight to also take control over some of the territory, since local tribes are also giving their allegiance to the new authorities. So this is the type of environment in which IS in the past has prospered, because its main enemies are just fighting each other as opposed to fighting IS. So in the meantime, it does give them some space, and they have used the space. At the same time, I think the US is also very aware of that, and we've seen the US also striking some of these areas. I think it's to send a signal as well that the US will continue to intervene based on its own national security understanding of the threat of IS in the region. So that's something that happens immediately. At the same time, IS also has had difficulties restructuring itself in the region because the US presence means that the US has had a lot of intelligence about the group, about how it tries to reorganize. And over the years, every time there was some attempts at a higher level of organization, the US has tracked them, in particular in Syria, but to some extent recently in Iraq also, where some cells have been attacked. But then the question mark will be in the long run, what happens? Who's going to be in charge in those areas? If it's, for example, HTS, will they try to find some modus operandi with Western countries, which Western countries probably would want, which HTS would benefit from in terms of its own legitimacy? So I think the threat really is more immediate than necessarily for the long run.
Thanks, Jerome. Delaney?
Yeah, just to come in quickly to remind those of us on the call of the history and of the history of U.S. presence in Syria. There are about 900 U.S. military personnel deployed in eastern and southern Syria, and there have been U.S. military personnel since 2015 for the counter ISIS mission. A big question mark is what will happen when the Trump administration comes in, and it's a big question mark because President Trump was repeatedly trying to pull forces out of Syria, and his advisors sort of stymied his goals in this regard. So the question will be, what will the Trump administration do now in his second term, and to what extent will they see U.S. forces in Syria as necessary to U.S. security interests?
Thank you, Delaney. I will stay with you, actually, to move and talk a bit about the sanctions. So you said in some of your interviews that not considering sanctions relief right now is like pulling the rug out from under Syria just when it's trying to stand. So because the sanctions topic is so complex, it would be great if you can briefly explain the different types of sanctions now in Syria and how they're affecting Syrians today.
Thanks, Christina. This is a really important issue, and it's a really complicated one. So I'm glad that you asked me about this. But the sanctions question will be central, I think, to all of our work in the future on Syria's recovery and on humanitarian efforts. And I noticed that there are many participants on this call who are part of the humanitarian community, so they'll know about the impacts that sanctions have had on their work over the years. But let me break it down in two ways. I think there are two sort of major buckets of sanctions that will need to be figured out for Syria. The first one is the terrorism sanctions that HTS is under. So HTS is listed as a terrorist by the UN, the UK, the EU, the US, Russia, Turkey, and other countries. But the US specific listing is a very difficult one, because the US lists HTS as a foreign terrorist organization, and the foreign terrorist organization listing is a very serious sanction because it's very easy to violate. Violation isn't just about providing financial support, it's also about providing training, advice, or assistance. And this means that the path towards providing any kind of help to HTS, I don't know whether it's advising them on their economic strategies or talking to them about how they should run an inclusive process or how they should build a constitution, all of these kind of things. The folks that are engaging with them on those questions will have to think very carefully about whether they're violating U.S. law by providing that kind of advice. And just to flag that a person can violate U.S. laws even if they're not a U.S. citizen, and even if that their violation has occurred outside of the United States. So it's a very serious sanction. So that's the terrorism sanctions on HTS, one bucket. The second bucket is the sanctions that are on Syria based on years of sanctions on the Assad regime. Syria was sanctioned in 1979 as a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States. Sanctions tightened in the early 2000s, and then they really ramped up in the context of the civil war and Assad's atrocities that followed. And so now what we're seeing is essentially more or less an embargo on Syria. You have US sanctions, EU sanctions, Canadian sanctions, all these other sanctions. There's sanctions on Syria's energy sector, on its banking sector. The central bank is under sanctions. It's a really overlapping, complicated web of sanctions. And so to even start to untangle those sanctions, I think will be an enormous lift for countries. But to answer your final question about what does this mean for Syria, and I've hinted at it, it's going to be very, very, very difficult for Syria to begin an economic recovery process with sanctions in place. Syria will have to revitalize its economy, revitalize its trade links with the outside world. Its banking sector will have to become more credible, and it's just very difficult. It's probably impossible for Syria to do that, at least if it wants to trade with the West and the United States and major economies, if it remains under the sanctions that are in place.
So what are the steps that need to be taken to start dismantling these sanctions, but also what conditions should HTS meet also to facilitate this process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll highlight 3 steps that can be taken immediately. The first step is for governments to issue a broad general license that allows for commercial and economic activity in Syria. Many of the viewers will know that there are humanitarian licenses in place. These licenses have been helpful, but they haven't been a silver bullet. There's still difficulties related to banking transfers, accessing important goods, etc. But what needs to happen is something far beyond the humanitarian licenses. There needs to be a license that allows for commercial activity, so Syria's economy can start revitalizing again. So that's the first, a broad general license. The second, governments need to start thinking now about what HTS can do to get off the sanctions list. We've seen from various governments over the past few days, sort of like Christmas lists of what HTS could possibly do. Some of the desires are quite vague. Some of them are conflicting, but governments need to think carefully about clear benchmarks they can set for HTS to get off the list. And I know my colleagues who are Syrian HTS experts have some ideas about what specifically they could be, but I think it's important to consider that these are terrorism listings, and so the involvement of HTS in terror needs to be like a central part of these discussions. And Jerome can tell you more, but HTS separated from Al Qaeda in 2016. It's presenting itself as making good on wanting to make good on many commitments about ensuring that Syria does not become a threat to any of its neighbors or the broader world. So these kind of commitments should be taken into account, and government should start thinking about what it's not going to take to get HTS off the list. And then a third thing that governments can do and should start to do now is they need to define a roadmap for sanctions relief for all of Syria. This is going to be an enormously complicated lift for the United States to lift sanctions on Syria. It's going to require legislative reform from Congress, White House action, Department of Commerce changes, State Department, Treasury. It's going to be a big lift. And so the United States and other countries need to think now about what a roadmap will look like for sanctions lifting. But as I keep banging on about, if this doesn't happen and it doesn't happen quickly, I think international actors are going to squander a really critical window of opportunity that's fast closing for Syria to regenerate and gain a more prosperous and peaceful future.
Thank you, Delaney. I think, Jerome, you'd like to, go ahead. Yes, I would like to add something. That's a discussion that we've had with other policymakers, with Delaney, with sanction experts, and so on. Ultimately, HTS has been listed for its association in the past to Islamic State and then to Al-Qaeda, and those were real connections. So it was listed by law because it was providing support, assistance to these organizations. Later on in 2016, HTS severed ties with Al-Qaeda. Later on, over the years, it clamped down on its members, preventing them from organizing or from having any military activities in the province of Idlib. The same with IS, which it basically destroyed. And so some of the issue that we are having now is many policymakers are thinking about conditions under which HTS could be delisted. And that includes respect for women's rights, for religious minorities, being inclusive, not interference in humanitarian affairs, and so on, which are all very worthy objectives that we all share, obviously. But the issue is that putting that type of conditions on a sanction that should be only about transnational violence / terrorism is also problematic in its own ways, because it means that we are not addressing what the sanctions should be about, which should be about transnational violence. So are those problematic? Yes, they are, but they can be addressed in different ways than only about sanctions on terrorism. So sometimes there is an issue. We understand why states want to have some leverage over HTS over these issues, and sanctions is part of the tools that they have. But this is also, an issue in its own way.
Yeah, thanks, Jerome. So we will start taking the questions from our audience. And on this topic, there's a question on, will the US and Western sanctions regime provide an opportunity for China to step in?
I can take this one. I think something that we have to be clear-eyed about is that if Syria is unable to trade with with Europe and the United States and other Western countries, it will have to seek other trading partners. In the few days after the fall of the Assad regime, we saw a tanker of Iranian crude that was heading towards Syria. Iran frequently supplied Syria with oil, turning around. And that shows it shows us all that obviously Syria will need oil to keep the lights on and to keep electricity going, right, and to continue to deliver basic services and so forth. US and EU sanctions affect the Syrian oil production and also their ability to import oil. And so, they will have to find a way to get oil. They will have to find a way to get other goods in. Over the past decade plus, they've been relying very much on Russia and Iran. If sanctions remain in place that make it very difficult for other countries to trade with Syria, they will just have to, by virtue of survival, have to trade with other countries.
Okay. Thank you, Delaney.
I'll step in here to add the kind of the effects of these sanctions on the ground, just to complement my colleagues. And as sanctions continue, or if sanctions continue, the situation on the ground will rely, or the economy on the ground will rely on informal sector, and the informal sector will continue to heavily rely or be monopolized in the hands of, let's say, relatively rogue armed non-state actors. Even when the Syrian regime was there was the economic sector was in the hands of businessmen, warlords, or armed non-state actors. So having sanctions or continue, this will lead Syria will continue into this informal sector, and sanctions will feed these non-state actors, which will further destabilize the country or keep the country in a vicious loop cycle. And right now, I want to add that the Syrian regime, the former Syrian regime, has had a network of 50 years old network of relying on informal networks and other countries to smuggle and get whatever it wants to get, including the example that Delaney mentioned about getting Iranian fuel. Right now, the new regime doesn't really have these venues, and will need to rely on the risk of this new regime relying on the same shady networks that will further drag the country. This is a very high risk, especially knowing that you can lift the sanctions very easily. And also, if something bad happens, or like you don't like the current trend or behavior of the new regime, you can just slap sanctions back again in a very easy way. So I just want to add that.
Thanks, Nanar. Yeah, we'll come back to this topic, Delaney, because we have a lot of other questions as well to change a bit the direction. So there's a question, I think, to Nanar. Is there any risk of a 2003 Iraq-like scenario, the de-Baathification?
Yeah, very good question. I would just take it back one step. So it's not about the Baathification. Al-Baath is not really well liked or well organized or well anything in Syria, to be honest. It's more about the exclusion part. Instead we could ask, is this a win for the opposition against the regime? Is it a win for the Syrian people that is led by the opposition against the regime and its cronies, or is it against the regime and its supporters? What we see right now, or the message that HTS is or the flag, the banner that HTS is raising, that we led the Syrian people to topple this very repressive, corrupt, and bad regime, and that's it. That's where it ends. We have nothing against whoever affiliated with the regime, whoever didn't side with the revolution, because there's a lot of things happened throughout this civil war. It varies from, Jerome touched upon it a bit, it varies from people that didn't side with the revolution into sub-communities that took up arms against the rebels. What's going to happen to those? Are they going to all be villainized? What we see right now, that HTS is saying, no, we're going to be inclusive. But what we see also is that HTS is saying that. We don't know yet. And this is very important to keep an eye on. Hopefully there won't be some sort of exclusion of sub-communities. And when I say this, and I really mean sub-communities, I don't only mean the Alawites. I also mean, for example, urban businessmen in Damascus and Aleppo that kind of didn't side with the revolution. Some of them even supported armed militias. What's going to happen with these? Those are legacy businessmen. So, and usually businessmen would side with the governing actor, just like they are siding with HTS now. Like there's something in, I can give an anecdote here in Al-Hamidiyya market, the same businessman that raised the banner against the terrorists, and now the same guy raised the banner against Iran. It's the same person, not even his family. So what I'm saying is, there's a lot of sub-communities that didn't actively participate in the revolution, and it's a 13 years old rebellion that was very bloody, and a lot of people died. A lot of, I mean, in the prisons alone, with 150 to 200,000. It is an astonishing number. So yeah. What's going to happen to these? The good thing is that HTS is saying, we're going to include people, but we're going to see in March. Are they going to do that or not?
Another question, I think, to you, Nanar, or I don't know if someone wants to comment on Russia and Iran, like two different questions. One relates to Russia's future presence in Syria, and notably its base in Tartus, with its obvious impact on Ukraine. Russia seems to be packing up, but would the panelists agree, or will it keep a lighter foot in Syria? Someone else is asking, is there a risk for Iran and Hezbollah to revive their interventions in Syria as well?
Yeah, I would like to take this. I would say this, it's a two-section answer. The first one, will Russia have which is a smaller one, will Russia have a presence in future Syria? Not the same presence. It will be limited if there will be a presence. This is what Russia is kind of negotiating with HTS right now. What we see is that Russia is hinting at delisting HTS for keeping some kind of presence, and the presence will be very limited to the naval base in Tartus and the air base in Hmeimim, in Latakia. There's also kind of hints that, look, you could use this naval base for humanitarian purposes. You know, we don't know. There's no decision has been taken yet. Iran, just to answer a question that's not asked, Iran definitely doesn't have HTS took a very clear side that Iran doesn't have a role in the future, but it doesn't want to antagonize Iran as well. It doesn't want to do anything hostile against Iran. As for the other part of the question, what role whether Iran, Hezbollah, or Russia will have, I think this will be answered with how minorities or how secure minorities are. So Syrian coast is the majority of the Syrian coast. If you go also into the middle of Syria, Homs and Hamas, or central Syria and the coast, there's a lot of minorities, and there's a lot of there was a lot of killings and like a typical civil war type of infighting, and the regime made sure of it. In Homs, I could say that at the beginning, in 2011, the regime took a step back out of Homs so it could allow for a civil war to kind of unfold, to shift the situation from regime versus people to people versus people. To come back to this question, how minorities are treated really determines how safe Syria is from external actors coming and intervening or being spoilers. If minorities, so the situation is very unstable for minorities right now. There's a lot of insecurities. There's a lot of, there isn't, HTS is still not managing or failing at controlling what is happening to minorities, and this is leading to a lot of fears. Whether these fears, how valid these fears are, it's an irrelevant question, because these fears will lead to some kind of reactions from minorities, and these reactions could start into localized insurgencies or localized rebellions. And these localized rebellions could be supported by any external actor that feels to be left out of Syria. So I would say it's very essential right now, and I'm sorry I took some time, but it's very important, yes, very important right now for HTS to focus on reining in the killings and lootings and harassment against minorities, to protect Syria from external actors.
Yeah, great, thank you. And other questions to Jerome. So they're asking about what's your assessment of HTS approach to human rights, especially women, inclusive governance, terrorism, and organized criminality. Drawing parallels to Afghanistan, all these factors are why the Afghan Taliban are not recognized on the international stage. Will HTS repeat the Taliban mistakes? Similar question as well on how HTS managed the transition from an insurgent group to a governing authority in northwest Syria. What challenges do you see, and do you think we're watching again the Taliban example?
Thank you. That's a very common comparison, comparing HTS to the Taliban, and even HTS itself often has drawn parallels, but we have to understand what they mean. What they mean in terms of the parallel is saying that you have to combine political and military means, so you can negotiate while you fight, which is what they wanted to do. And the second one is that you have to take distance from transnational jihad. For them, it was never to say that we follow the same model, we have the same religious approach, and so on, because they're clearly not. When we compare both of them, I mean, very briefly, the Taliban was a state that then was destroyed by the US invasion, but that came back somehow as a state in exile. That's why they're calling themselves, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So they see themselves, even before the takeover of Kabul, as a state in being. The case of HTS was always very different. For HTS, it was more an elite military group that was not really good in doing social services, that had to do it at some point before the creation of HTS, because there was competition with other actors, and they had to, at some point, provide some services, specifically in the courts of justice. But it never saw itself as a state in being. So they always relied on more delegation of some of these issues to other actors, as long as they could still maintain some level of control. And so that's how they basically transform from a military group to a government, is to say we create institutions and we can to some extent control these institutions, but these institutions can also recruit their own personnel and so on, that we don't have to micromanage. So it was always somehow like taking a bit of distance from the civilian part of governance while still controlling it, which is very different from the Taliban that saw itself as a state that rules through its own judges and so on. And that largely explains, the outcome of their governance. In terms of women's rights, at some point there was some pushback into implementing more Islamic rules, Hizbah, in Idlib, but there was a pushback by the population. So every time they retreated, and ultimately, they stopped pushing for these laws. They've been mostly criticized for some of the arrests of activists and of political opponents, and there were demonstrations over the past year. But again, then they tried to also open up and do some reforms, which many have criticized for not being enough. But there was a type of give and take approach to governance, pushback from the population, so we make concessions and so on. Regarding the question, it was always very much clear about terrorism and criminality, because for them, ensuring stability of the province was always key. And that explains, for my last point also, their different position with regards to foreign fighters. The Taliban has much closer ties, for example, to the Pakistani Taliban, and doesn't really feel that it can push the Pakistani Taliban the way it wants, because potentially the Pakistani Taliban or parts of them could join ISK, which would then be an issue for the Taliban. So the Taliban in Afghanistan has to manage foreign fighters by being quite sensitive and not pushing them too much so that they don't become enemies. But HTS had a different approach. Over its governance of Idlib, it basically marginalized the most radical voices among them. And so some remain, even with quite radical ideas, much more than HTS, but they're mostly under control because their number is much more limited and because their most radical elements have been purged over the years. So somehow it becomes a more containable threat for them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jerome. We'll answer now with Berkay some of the Turkey questions. So there are many. I will say it to you and see how you will combine it together. One question, is there a risk that Turkey engages in forcible return of Syrian refugees? Other questions on Ankara's reaction to Israel's bombing of Syrian military sites and expansion into Syrian territory. There are several questions on Israel. Maybe we can talk about it after that. And did Press-elect Trump's comments press conference on Tuesday. Okay, sorry, I lost the electricity. Now you know that I live in Lebanon. Comments press conference on Tuesday regarding Syria signaled that his administration may be comfortable with the Turkish hegemony over the Syrian region. I'm the ghost here.
Yes, so on the refugee question, so I think, it's very hard to predict, of course, but of course, Turkey has shown quite a lot of generosity towards Syrian refugees. It has hosted over 3 million refugees for a really long period of time. So I think, from the outset, from also strategically, when you think about it, and reputation-wise, it would make sense for Ankara to, create incentives for refugee returns. And you could potentially, combine that or also have that together with rebuilding efforts in Syria, where you could encourage, returns by offering people also livelihoods in Syria, or at least the prospect thereof. And of course, having a friendly population in Syria that has sort of seen that has spent a lot of time in Turkey and has been, welcomed, although there are also problems, of course, that many people, many refugees face. I think that is also an important soft power. There's an important soft power dimension to that in terms of Ankara's longer term influence. So I think the approach will probably, we'll probably not see a mass moving out of people and forcible returns and things like that. On the other question, President-elect Trump's potential approach to Turkey and how that may reflect on Syria's northeast. It's true. I think there are expectations that, the Trump administration could have a bit of a more pragmatic approach and try to work with Turkey on a more strategic footing down the line. Whether that's going to transpire, I'm actually not sure. The signals are mixed, I would say. This statement recently that seemed to be alluding to that. but then you also have other people that are going to play important roles in their administration who actually have made contrary statements. So I think it's still to be seen on where the Trump administration will land on how it will approach Turkey. But I think there is, an expectation, especially, in Ankara now, that things may be changing, and the U.S. Could potentially be less. They could be more aligned with the U.S., including on Syria.
Thank you. I think we can talk a bit now on Israel. There was a question that I left to the end. So maybe Nanar, you can answer that. There are so many different questions about Israel. It's willing to expand, how they're benefiting from the instability in Syria now. So if you can give us very briefly, Nanar, on the situation on that side of the border.
Yeah. So with the current, with Assad being toppled, Israel has a lot to gain, although Israel hasn't really been active in the Syrian civil war, and any actions were taken by Israel throughout the civil war were highly like security-centric and defensive. What Israel has to gain is basically with Syria not being close to Iran anymore and part of this axis of resistance, this kind of marks the end of the axis of resistance. Syria is no longer the logistical backbone for Hezbollah that proved over the years to be extremely helpful. There is no Iranian presence in Syria. There's no fears of Iranian-backed militias, getting closer to Israelis' northern borders. So from this part, Israel has a lot to gain. However, also Israel sees looks at the situation from a security lens. So it's looking at the uncertainties of more what it fears to be jihadist actors or extremist groups taking control of its borders. It's fearing instability or lack of security on its northern borders. So what Israel has been doing is that they have conducted an incursion into Syria, into the demilitarized area where now there's Israeli troops even in Syrian villages, northern and northwestern area. I would say that Israel will, in addition to that, Israel has conducted I think it was argued that the biggest air campaign in its history. They basically launched a war against the new Syrian army before it's formed. They decimated more than 70% of the equipments. This includes air defense, strategic missiles. 2 days ago, in where strategic missiles are, a lot of them are based by the coast. The destruction led to an earthquake. So it continues to do that. I would say, of course, that Israel's narrow focus on security might lead to security issues down the line, and not focusing on stabilizing or leaving some space for the new state to kind of have a say if it wants to be hostile against Israel or not, especially since the HDS said very clearly that we do not, we don't want to fight Israel. I would stop at that.
Thank you. Since we are in this area, maybe talk about a bit with Jerome about the south, because we have a question on if you can develop on the situation in southern Syria and the nuance, how strong is HTS presence in this area, far away from their Idlib stronghold. Jerome?
I go or Dada, you start?
So the question is on southern Syria and how HTS, the presence of HTS there. Do they have leverage? Do they have presence?
Basically, they've recognized that for the past year or so, they were coordinating the new armed groups in the south that are the remnants of what preceded with the Southern Front. So we can expect the coordination to continue. At the same time, now the issue also will be part of what about their integration within Syria, because those are not fully constitutive of the military alliance from Idlib. So they're not like the strongest armed groups which whom HTS has allied for the past 5 years. So now they will have to continue these discussions. HTS is sending military personnel there, but as Nanar mentioned earlier on in the discussion, even the military means of HTS are limited. They can't control the full country only with their forces. So they will also need some type of delegation with existing forces in the south. I think it will be very difficult for them to avoid it at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jerome. So we still have around 10 minutes. I will continue taking some other questions. There is also to Jerome, you mentioned that HTS has made sure to invest in security, but are they involved in any way in any illicit economy? And there's another similar question. Has the political economy of Syria's illicit sectors changed since HTS takeover, or is there any risk of it changing?
I mean, initially, when HTS was in control of Idlib, so they did control a big part of the local economy, but also of the official economy with the foreign countries through, for example, Bab el Hawa, through which most of the goods and would be provided to the province of Idlib. But then, like any of the other actors, they were involved also in all sorts of smuggling with that happened within Syria. But the smuggling is going to be very different now. I mean, initially it was mostly, for example, getting petrol from the eastern part, going to the north, going to then to Idlib and so on. But now you don't really have that anymore. So now that you are heading a state, you don't necessarily rely upon just limited reserves within Syria. So now, as a state, they will have to deal also with foreign countries, providing also some of these goods directly. So smuggling is not actually going to be part of that, or at least not the way it was before. At the same time, the regime has largely relied for the past few years on the export of Captagon, this drug that they exported in Jordan and in Gulf countries. So that's most likely going to stop, not only because it's not in the interest of HTS, but also this is going to be a big point of pressure by foreign countries. No country now is going to allow for this to continue. So that's going to change as well. But basically, the whole economy is going to be transformed. But what we have to follow primarily is what happens with regard to the sanctions, because illegal economy is also an outcome of necessity to some extent. So first of all, the focus should be on the sanctions, on the recreation of a more stable economy for Syria, and that can largely prevent the more illegal part of the economy, smuggling and so on.
Thank you, Jerome. I hope you can see me. But Delaney,
I'll just piggyback on the last part of Jerome's intervention, just to offer some statistics. During the course of the civil war, Syrian trade contracted by about 80%. Inflation last year was 93%. And last year, the pound depreciated against the dollar by 141%. So HTS is leading a country now was recently leading a country that's really in horrific shape economically. The Syrian banking sector is virtually a black box, very difficult to engage with the Syrian banking sector. It almost doesn't function and exist. And so the question of, what next for the illicit economy is a really tough question. When we talk about trade reducing by 80%. I mean, there is trade happening, as Jerome and Nanar have mentioned, but it's illicit. It's not on the books. And so sanctions are a step, but there will have to be an enormous effort to shift the economy from this direction that it's been going in towards illicit and a major contraction over the past decade plus to a licit economy with trade with the outside world, with the production of resources, et cetera, et cetera. So will be an enormous challenge.
Mm-hmm. Another question to you, Delaney and Berkay. I think Berkay can take this. What stance would the USA and HTS take if a conflict were to break out between Kurdish-led forces and SNA? Additionally, could such a conflict potentially trigger further internal or external displacement of people living in these areas of the country?
Yeah, I think that's the risk for the Northeast, and that's why the escalation is going to be important and putting things on track for some sort of an end state that is durable and stable. But of course, you know, the HTS is already quite overstretched. They have a lot of other issues to deal with at this point in time. So the Northeast descending into chaos is certainly not something they would want, and you know, that would potentially also, you know, maybe draw them into the fold. We've seen some groups in Manbij after the SNA went in there now calling for HTS to come in and support and control that area. You know, if that's sort of a growing dynamic, then that will just make the new Damascus government also more difficult for them to deal with this reality, as they're already overstretched. So I think it's and you know, the U.S. policy, I mean, for now under this administration, it looks like there's an approach to stay the course and remain there and to try to de-escalate and maybe work through diplomatic channels to try to push the sides towards some sort of an end state that is stable. But of course, you know, under Trump, as Delaney already said, I mean, it's very unclear where the U.S. administration will land on this.
Great. Sorry, we have a lot of questions, and I don't think we will manage to answer all of them. So I will take one more and then end with the topic of accountability, because we also have a lot of questions on this topic. A question now to Delaney. Can you elaborate on the humanitarian exemptions in the sanctions regime? She mentioned it is no silver bullet, but will it be sufficient to allow humanitarians to massively scale up their activities in the next as many will hope to do now? We have access to areas previously under government of Syria control.
Yeah, that's an important question. I'd say that they're no silver bullet because there are licenses that allow for humanitarian activities and that also allow for the goods and services that humanitarians depend on. So you have a license from the United States, a license from the EU. You have UN Security Council Resolution 2664, which applies to the 1267 listing of HTS. That's the terrorism sanction on HTS. Unfortunately, we've seen in the past in Syria that these licenses aren't comprehensive. I mean, they're very important. I know MSF will have a team of lawyers that will advise you on exactly what you can do, and not just like other humanitarian organizations. But I'll just flag some of the gaps that we've seen in the past. During the earthquake response, for instance, there was an additional license beyond the licenses that already exist for humanitarian work, specifically for earthquakes, that was provided by the U.S. Treasury, and it allowed even more activities than normal to provide earthquake relief. But humanitarians found that two problems. The first one was the license wasn't comprehensive. It didn't cover all U.S. sanctioning departments. So it didn't cover, for instance, the export controls that are issued by the Department of Commerce. And this meant that humanitarians had trouble bringing in things like diggers, advanced medical equipment. They had to wait for a long time to get licenses from the Department of Commerce. Sometimes the licenses didn't come. And so that's like one area where the licenses aren't comprehensive. And then the second area, which my MSF colleague will know well, is this issue of over-compliance and de-risking. NGOs for many years have had a real trouble getting banks to facilitate their transfers into Syria, getting goods imported into Syria, moving goods into Syria, basically because banks and other firms have said, it's just too risky for us to engage in such a heavily sanctioned country. The compliance costs are too high. We're spending too much money on lawyers. We just would rather not engage in this country. We'd rather say no to the transaction. I think, unfortunately, with the sanctions environment that we're seeing, I can't imagine why that wouldn't be the case. I really hope that governments institute a broad general license and also work to change this terrorism listing, which will also spook the private sector to engage with the Syria that's controlled by a listed party. But it's still going to be an enormous challenge, this overcompliance and de-risking element. And so I hope that humanitarian agencies can scale up. It's an amazing opportunity to get to areas that have been very difficult to reach for a long time. But there will need to be some action on the sanctions front.
Great. I think we will end with the topic of accountability. 2 questions. Nanar, you can answer those, but others feel free to jump in as well. Any consideration of accountability going on, efforts being made to preserve evidence, international tribunal, or Syrian courts? Are Syrian courts in a position to deliver justice? Another question, very similar on criminal accountability, as many victims and survivors, particularly related to missing persons, also see justice as a priority for them.
Yep. Accountability and transitional justice are very important in addressing past grievances and fostering long-term stability. However, it's very important to approach transitional justice in a very careful way to avoid adding existing ethno-sectarian tensions. It's very important that transitional justice would be led by specific groups that are inclusive of civil society, and transitional justice would apply to all actors in Syria. At this stage, especially those 3 months, I would say it's very premature to implement transitional justice, and I would say also it should not be implemented by the current by HTS, at least right now. Of course, HTS should take part of it later down the future. When it comes to collecting evidence, there's a lot of good work that's happening right now into collecting evidence. There has been attempts to get, for example, like Said Naya, to get the video evidence. There has been, since the 8th of December, there has been quite a bit of people trying to make sense, or civil society trying to make sense of the documents that they found in security forces buildings and in prisons, and all of that is added to civil society collecting evidence, and have been doing a great work for over a decade now. So there's, I would say, in this aspect, there's quite a bit of work that is being done and preparing for a transitional justice phase.
Great. Thank you, Nanar. And on this, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. I think it was a great panel, but I'm sorry for all the people who asked questions that we didn't manage to answer them. Hopefully, we'll have a follow-up call on this, but you can still watch the recording on YouTube. It will stay there. Thank you so much for the panelists and for all the people who joined us today.